Good morning, folks. We are continuing our conversation about our textbooks, Fallacies of Relevance. It's our textbooks, Chapter 4. We're going to be talking about the rest of the fallacies from this list, and I'm not going to necessarily be discussing them in the same order that they are listed in the textbook, mostly because I wanted to make sure I have enough coverage for some of the ones that students frequently miss, even after they've had the lecture on it. Now I'm basically saying that to let you know, make sure that you get these concepts down so you don't err on them later on. Now I want to start by talking about this fallacy known as appeal to ignorance. I want to start with appeal to ignorance. This is the fallacy on this list that students most frequently misunderstand or get wrong later on. They get hung up on this word ignorance, and they make this mistake. They think anytime anyone has made an ignorant, aka false statement, it's an appeal to ignorance. No, that's not what an appeal to ignorance is. Appeal to ignorance occurs when the structure of the person's argument looks like this. Person will make a claim something like this. Such and such is the case. Such and such can be anything. Now take a guess what a challenger will ask. Why do you think so? And the kind of reason that the person will give will run something like this. No opponents have disproven it. No opponents have disproven it. Now, the reason why somebody else is disproving it is irrelevant to whether or not we should accept this first position, is because if you are the person making some kind of truth claim, you are the one that has the burden of proof. It is not fair game for you to say, well, can you disprove me, man? No. You make the claim, you have the burden of proof. The reason why it is called an appeal to ignorance is because what this person is actually appealing to is a lack of an ability to prove or disprove a particular position. And he treats it as proof positive of his own position, when in fact, if we can neither prove nor disprove a particular position, we are ignorant. In other words, we don't know what the answer is. If you don't actually have any evidence one way or another, a rational person suspends judgment and says, I am ignorant. I do not know what position I should take. That is roughly why it is called an appeal to ignorance. Now, in their book, Critical Thinking by Moore and Parker, I think still from Sonoma State University in California, they actually refer to appeal to ignorance as the burden of proof fallacy. Because they know that students get hung up on this word ignorance, and thus they end up missing, the point of what this fallacy is, they say, well, how about we give it a name? I'm putting words into their mouth a little bit here. How about we give it a name that actually explains exactly what happens when a person commits this fallacy? They fail to accept the burden of proof, and they shift the burden of proof to somebody else to disprove them. And that's really not their place. Because if you're the one who makes a truth claim, you have the burden of proof. Now let me go for an easy textbook example. The textbook has a couple of examples, but one of the practice problems at the end of the chapter, I'll go over it. It's sort of what we would call a paradigm case of appeal to ignorance. It's number 18. I'll read it. Argument heard all too frequently in introductory philosophy class. We're perfectly entitled to believe there is a God. After all, every effort by atheists to prove otherwise has failed. Now you'll notice the person does not accept the burden of proof and say, I'm going to prove the existence of God. And I have a legitimate reason for believing in God. They shift the burden of proof to the critics. If you make a claim that is legitimate to believe in God, you ought to be able to supply the reasons for doing so instead of saying, well, can you disprove me? No, let's just shift to the burden of proof.
So with the example that you described, with him switching over, his burden of proof would have been him switching over to the atheist side, correct? So him speaking upon.
Well, yeah, and he's saying, well, can you disprove me?
Okay.
Well, you make the claim, you're the one that has the burden of proof. By the way, you can probably think of some political examples where appeals to ignorance implicitly are taking place. If somebody makes a claim that a particular country is a threat to world peace, and then you say, well, Mr. Diplomat, why do you think this country is a threat to world peace? And he comes back with a quip like, well, no one has definitively shown that they're not. Well, that doesn't prove anything. If you make the claim that they're a definite threat to world peace, you better be able to supply the darn evidence for it. To shift the burden of proof to the other guy and say, but can you show that it isn't? Is a paradigm case of this appeal to ignorance. And this is why Moore and Parker renamed this fallacy burden of proof. Pseudo-reasoning is what they call it. Yeah, if you're going to make a claim, you actually own the burden of proof. To shift the burden of proof is to appeal to something irrelevant as to whether or not we should accept a position or not. Is that pretty fair? Thanks. Now let's look at a couple more of these. This one's a sort of easier one, so I'm going to run through it. At the end of the chapter, there is a discussion of the slippery slope fallacy. Many of my students, before they come to this course, have heard this phrase, to go down a slippery slope. As a matter of fact, this is a phrase that is sometimes used outside of complicated, logic settings. I have heard political commentators use the phrase, that will take us down a dangerous slippery slope. Now, here's what a slippery slope argument means. It contends that if we take some seemingly benign first step, that a disastrous chain of events will necessarily follow. Now, slippery slope arguments, I should say slippery slope fallacies, frequently occur on popular political wedge issues. Suppose, and here's the easy example from the textbook, the so-called gateway drug slippery slope. Well, we can't take this small move to legalize medicinal marijuana. After all, if we do that, then next somebody will be crying for all-out legalization. And then pretty soon, reefer madness will happen. Yeah, I like to call it the reefer madness slippery slope. We also hear things like, we heard this on the debate over healthcare payment reform, when they said, well, if we make this move, and by the way, what they call Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, there's really nothing socialist about it. As a matter of fact, it is a pro-business solution that more or less guaranteed insurance companies money. As a matter of fact, actual socialists were totally against it. Or I should say people who are labeled socialists. As a matter of fact, they wanted a single-payer system. Well, for people who are afraid of single-payer systems, they call them out-and-out socialism. They said the Affordable Care Act is one small step towards socialism. And socialism has failed wherever it's taken place. Do you want communist gulags and so forth? Now, you notice why these slippery slope fallacies are sometimes rhetorically convincing. And I'm going to appeal to something else on our fallacy list. And this is because oftentimes these are issues that people are fearful about. In other words, there are also a sort of scare tactic involved. That if we do this, then all of your fears will be realized. Now, these are slippery slope fallacies. But if you also suggest that there's some kind of appeals to fear going on, I certainly wouldn't fault you on that. Because that is typically the kind of thing that takes place when we talk about a slippery slope. Now, let me give you one more example. Slippery slope arguments regarding freedom of speech have actually been with us for over 100 years at this point. The idea is, if we restrict speech freedoms on this particular issue, whose freedom of speech will be saved? Because someone else will ask to restrict this. Someone else will ask to restrict this. Someone else, and pretty soon, the political floor will be empty because we won't be able to speak our minds on much of anything. This is one of those slippery slope arguments made about freedom of speech, or I should say against any kind of restrictions of free speech. Now you notice I've heard them from the other side too. If we allow this speech act, which is hate speech, to take place, then we are just emboldening this act of hate speech, this act of hate speech. And pretty soon, no one will be safe to say anything because of the hate. Yeah, slippery slope arguments. Now, admittedly, many of these slippery slope arguments might be convincing for another reason. Because it does seem, in some cases, that if we start to move in a particular direction, that there will be a sort of snowball effect that will occur. But here's the reason why it's still a fallacy. If you're going to claim that taking a first step is going to lead to catastrophe, you better do a little more work to explain why it will necessarily happen. In other words, it just may happen, but you've got to do your homework. You actually have to explain how taking the first seemingly benign step is going to lead here. In other words, argue fully why I should believe that going from this step here, that we're going to get to here.
And if they want to be vice versa still?
How do you mean?
Basically, like, if they're against the first step.
Yeah, well, the idea here is they're basically saying we cannot take this first step because it will lead here.
Okay.
And the idea is, let's say, this is just of course for illustration's sake. This is step W, which is the benign, seemingly benign first step. Z right here is catastrophe. The idea is that there's going to be ensuing things that would happen in between, that you would actually need to explain why those are necessarily going to happen. Because the fact is, there have been many cases where taking that benign first step was indeed just a benign first step that really didn't lead to anything else.
So basically, you just have to explain, like you said,
Yeah.
Up until the bottom part.
Yeah. I'll go for one more, what do they call, low-hanging fruit example. These are the kind of arguments that are frequently made on things like gun control. A person will say, if we take this one benign, seemingly benign step to ask for universal background checks and to restrict certain people from acquiring certain kinds of guns, pretty soon, nobody but the government will be able to have guns. They will come in and confiscate your guns. Well, my response to that slippery slope fear-mongering argument is, we have had what some people call common sense gun legislation for quite a while. And President Obama never came to get your guns. In other words, the fear-mongering doesn't seem to have come to fruition. But nonetheless, these slippery slope arguments on gun control continue to be pervasive in the political sphere. Even though there have been plenty of years when little steps on gun control have taken, and the man hasn't come to get your guns. And that's why I would say it's a slippery slope fallacy, not a legitimate slippery slope argument. I would say if indeed they were out to take your guns, they would have taken them a long, long time ago. Because conversations about this have been going on since the 1970s. They really have. And those of us who've been around a little while, not that I'm that long in the tooth, you know, we've sort of seen these slippery slope arguments made. And of course, yeah, the benign steps are taken and nothing actually becomes of it. So this tells me a lot of these R&D fallacies. Next. I'm going to take this pair together, and this is because they are kind of mirror opposites of one another. Composition and division. Folks, these are sometimes referred to as grouping fallacies in some books I've seen. And I'll explain to you why in a minute. Now, folks, whenever we commit a composition fallacy, what we are automatically inferring incorrectly is that if the parts of something have a particular attribute or set of attributes, that guess what will also have the same set of attributes? The entire thing that we are talking about. If the parts of something have a particular characteristic or attribute, it will necessarily be found in the entire thing. Division fallacy does the exact opposite. It contends that if the entire thing that we are talking about has a particular characteristic, it will necessarily also be found in what? Found in the individual parts. Now, here's a cliche that might help you to wrap your head around this. You can't necessarily infer from the parts to the whole. You cannot necessarily infer from the whole to the parts. In other words, you need more information. You need more relevant information to determine if you can make that assertion. Now, let me go for an easy example that's kind of discussed in the textbook when it comes to composition. There are some advertisements that actually beg us to commit the composition fallacy. What a company might do to advertise for sale prices of durable goods, you know, things like washing machines, things of this nature, things that last a while, but also what? Yeah, they cost a lot of money. So take a guess how they convince you to pay for this thing that costs some money. Those low monthly payments. Now, what they hope that you'll do is that you'll reason that because the individual payments are low, that the total what? Yeah, the total cost will be low. The fact is, the total cost may actually be quite high, and it might actually be a ripoff. But they hope that their audience will infer that if the individual payments are low, that the total cost will be low, when that's certainly not the case, because small increments add up. Now, there's a practice problem that I didn't assign at the end of the chapter. It was the one where the person says, when I go to the casino, I only pay the quarter slots, because that way I'm guaranteed not to lose a lot of money. Well, guess what? That just presupposes that you're not there losing money for 8 hours. Simply because the increments of your loss are small doesn't mean that the sum total will be small. Now, let me give another example that might appeal to students who are into philosophical issues. This is one that we actually discuss in Intro to Philosophy. It has been a perennial argument in the history of Western thought that people have argued that because the parts of the universe that we have encountered seem to be mathematically well ordered, that we can infer that the entire cosmos is also mathematically well ordered. And then they leap to the conclusion, this must prove that a wise deity exists. Otherwise, where would the order have come from? Well, the philosopher David Hume points out in his dialogues concerning natural religion that this argument commits a composition fallacy, even though he doesn't drop the word composition fallacy. He asks, how much of the cosmos have we actually experienced? An infinitesimally small part. As a matter of fact, we are so small in the grand scheme of things, we don't even know if the cosmos has an end or a beginning. In other words, in the grand scheme of things, we actually don't know a whole lot. So to take our minuscule knowledge of what we have experienced and then to draw an inference about something like the cosmos is a logical leap. It is a serious logical leap. Yeah, composition fallacy. Now, division fallacy does exactly the opposite. It takes the inference that if an entire thing has a particular characteristic, that each of its individual parts will. And this is, I guess, the easy example that we hear from extended family members. They'll make a bold claim that the Congress is entirely incompetent. And then they'll say, well, so-and-so's got to be entirely incompetent because she's a member of Congress, and Congress is incompetent. Well, guess what that forgets about? Yeah, well, simply because the entire thing might have a particular attribute, it doesn't necessarily mean all of the individual parts do. And this is very cliche, but it's apt. The sum total of the parts doesn't always add up to the whole. And the sum total of the whole doesn't necessarily indicate anything about the individual parts. And this is another one of those easy sort of examples. If you're a sports fan, perhaps you're well aware that some teams that are real winners oftentimes are not composed of all superstars. And this is because superstars aren't always the best team players. And when they throw a lot of superstars together who don't have team chemistry, things oftentimes don't work out very well. So to infer simply because this team won the championship, therefore they must have the best individual players, fails to recognize that the sum total of the whole sometimes is more than the sum total of the individual parts. In other words, to go back to that word relevance, there are other relevant factors at play that need to be taken into account. That's to tie together why these are fallacies of relevance here. Now, questions or comments? I hope that was, yeah, Mr. Carball.
I kind of took composition and division as like that really bad saying that like not all Muslims are terrorists, but all Muslims are all terrorists are Muslims. I took it like that saying, like, is that composition?
Well, and granted, I'd rather you not use that because what you're talking about will actually apply to something that we will see in chapter 5. And since you're asking, I'll talk about it now. What Mr. Carball is talking about is something we'll see in chapter 5, but we've technically already seen it in our discussion of argument patterns. He is talking about what are called generalizations, or sometimes simply called inductive generalizations. When we induce something, what we do is we make observations, say about groups of people, and then we draw conclusions about that group of people in general. Now keep in mind, simply because a few people from a particular demographic might engage in political violence doesn't necessarily mean that all members of that group do. Now, I see why you looked at this as composition, because it seems to be going from the parts to the whole. But more simply put, I would probably call that a poor inductive generalization. But nice thinking and good question. More on that when we talk about fallacies of induction in chapter 5, by the way. Next thing's next. Appeal to pity. I probably don't have to say too much about the appeal to pity. When we make an appeal to pity, folks, we argue that a person should cut someone. It's almost always about cutting somebody some slack, on the grounds that we should feel sorry for that person. The idea with the appeal to pity is a person will ask you to do something for him or her, and then the reasons that they will give will be about all of the difficulties that they have recently had. Now, I'll give you an example that an instructor might deal with. Suppose I bust a student for plagiarism. It has happened before. And the student says, but I can't fail this class. I'm already on academic probation. And all the things in my life are going badly. Well, guess what, folks? There's probably nothing wrong with feeling sorry for a person who is down on their luck, even if they are down on their luck due to their own misgivings. Because people who get into trouble usually tend to find more trouble because it snowballs. Now, simply because I might feel sorry or compassion for someone doesn't mean I should let it do what? Yeah, cloud my judgment about right and wrong. Now, the reasons why the author puts this into the broader category of fallacies of relevance is because your pity for someone should not be relevant in how you arbitrate particular issues. Your sympathy can get in the way of your using good judgment. But we really should take our business to them. They're a mom and pop store and they're having a lot of difficulties. Don't we really want to keep them in business? Well, the prices are higher and a whole lot of the things that I want, they don't have at that store. It's okay to feel sorry for somebody, but it's not necessarily relevant in how you should behave or how you should act. Is that pretty clear, I hope? Appeal to fear. Folks, appeal to fear, just like appeal to pity, there are certain things that perhaps morally decent people would feel pity for other people for. But you shouldn't let it cloud your rational judgment. Same way with appeal to fear. It is reasonable to be fearful of certain things. But keep in mind, it is not a logical or rational reason to do or not to do something. Now, suppose that a parent says, son, you better do X. And of course, when son says, why should I do X? In other words, son wants what? Son wants a rational reason for why you should do X. And if I say, because I'll strip you of your allowance if you don't. Now you'll notice that son might go ahead and do it. But you'll notice he's doing it out of fear of losing his allowance. Not because there's necessarily a logical reason to do so. Appeals to fear are used in international politics all the time. You know, where the country with superior firepower, yeah, I'll be blunt about it, can typically say, well, you better do X. Well, why should I do X? Because we've got bullets pointed at you. Well, guess what? You haven't been given a logical reason why you should do X. But you certainly have been out of fear, been coerced into doing X. Indeed, appeals to fear oftentimes work. Just keep in mind that they are not logical appeals. They are forceful type of appeals. Equivocation. This is one that students sometimes have difficulty wrapping their heads around. Now, if we say that a term is equivocal, what we mean is that the word has more than one meaning. To say that a word is an equivocal word is to say that it has more than one meaning. Now, here's what the fallacy of equivocation is. Equivocation occurs when an argument depends upon a word or phrase in the argument having the same meaning. Equivocation occurs when an argument's being acceptable or not depends upon a key word or phrase having a constant meaning throughout the entire argument. When equivocation takes place, a shift in usage takes place. Ergo, the conclusion does not necessarily follow because the word isn't used consistently throughout. Now, here's an equivocation that frequently takes place in my philosophy classrooms, and I have to point it out. When we speak of freedom, folks, we might be philosophically speaking of it in several different ways. If you've taken an intro to philosophy class, you have probably had a conversation about this concept called freedom of the will. Now, the reason why this is conceptually important to some of us is freedom of the will is usually connected with our ability to act, that is, without coercion, and thus to be held accountable for it. Now, I've had students say, well, of course we have free will, because we live in a free country. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. You're mistaking freedom of the will for this. You're mistaking freedom of the will for political liberty. In other words, you're using the word freedom in two different senses. And by the way, the fact that you might have political liberty is irrelevant to whether or not you have free will or not. Because free will is dependent upon whether or not you are just a biological machine or not. It is depending on there being an actual self that is not just a product of genetics and operant conditioning and other kinds of conditioning. And guess what? The fact that you have political liberty is irrelevant to whether or not you have free will. But because the word freedom is a word that seems operative in both, and this is why I prefer not to talk about political freedom. I prefer to use the word liberty so students don't commit that equivocation. Johnson.
Yeah, the example you gave a couple weeks ago about the cigarettes and grass.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because I promised I'd mentioned it before. You remember that sample syllogism in the textbook where they said all things that are grass is green. Some cigarettes are made out of grass, therefore some cigarettes are green. Now I think the author was trying to be a joker there, intentionally so, because the word grass was used equivocally. I mean, grass, of course, means the stuff that's outside. It's a little brown and mucky since it's winter, so it's not literally green. And of course, grass is slang from Mary Jane, weed, reefer, marijuana. I don't know what other names there are for it, but the word grass is a word that is equivocal. It has more than one meaning. And that was why that syllogism was guilty of the fallacy of four terms.
Is that why, well, like you just explained, being as though that he used the grass, because I remember he compared the topic like living outside, and then he used it like, I think he used grass, like you said, twice.
Yeah,
so,
he used it twice, but there were two different meanings.
Okay, so when it's recognized twice and it's like totally two different subjects, that's how you know it's
yeah, that's how you know it's equivocation. Now, one more example from the textbook. The author of the text does use the concept of equivocation in a more expansive sense. He says that equivocation is implicitly used in some advertising when they use words that have ambiguous meanings. And those ambiguous meanings can sometimes be used to sway us to hold a point of view that doesn't necessarily follow. When something is called low fat, this is the easy example. Low fat, of course, has a sort of legal nutrition definition. But in the advertising world, it has a much looser meaning. In other words, it can mean just about anything, but it sounds very, very good. Yeah, low sugar. Well, low sugar simply means lower than the high sugar, but it still might also be high sugar, that kind of thing. Yeah, so the author contends that, beware of words that are by their very nature equivocal, because you might be conned into taking a position or buying a product on false pretenses. Oh, one other thing I didn't mention. It oftentimes does take two to equivocate. Why? The person using the word and the person to interpret it. Now, last one. I'm saving this one for last because in general, I don't want you to use this one. In general. I didn't say not to use it, but in general, I'd rather you not use it. This is because students oftentimes misunderstand it, and they also find it to be a convenient catch-all for all of the fallacies in Chapter 4. I'm talking about irrelevant reasoning. Folks, the historical philosophical name for this fallacy is non-sequitur. I'm sure some of you have heard of the idea of bringing in a non-sequitur. A non-sequitur means that somebody brings something into the conversation that is, what's the cliche, out of left field. In other words, it doesn't seem to be germane whatsoever to what we're talking about or what conclusion someone is trying to draw. Now, in a sense, because we've said that all of these fallacies in Chapter 4 are indeed fallacies of relevance, I frequently have students just tagging them all as irrelevant reasoning, when in fact this fallacy non sequitur typically has a much more specific meaning. And it runs something like this. When someone makes a claim, whatever that claim might be, and then the reasons that they give for it, they seem relevant, but are actually not. Now, I'll go for some easy examples, because that is kind of a vague definition. And this is part of why you need kind of illustrating examples. Politicians, when they frequently talk about the idea of harsh punishment for crimes, they say, well, we wouldn't want to give would-be criminals the idea that we are soft on crime. Therefore, we have to pass these draconian laws. Well, folks, that's really not a relevant reason to whether or not the draconian laws should be passed. The question is, do the laws work? I've heard politicians say, well, we have to drop these bombs on these people, because if we don't, we won't be sending them the message that we shouldn't be meddling with. Well, the question is it good policy to just drop bombs on people who you don't happen to agree with? Is it good policy? In other words, on the surface, it may look what? It may look relevant when in fact it's not really relevant. Now, in general, if something fits into some other category in this chapter, please don't use this as a sort of convenient catch-all. Cheers for now.